And avoidant individuals are especially vulnerable to this state because their entire emotional architecture is built around self-protection. They learned early that vulnerability equals danger, that emotional exposure leads to loss of control. So when they become aware, consciously or unconsciously, that they treated you poorly, their nervous system doesn't move toward repair. It moves toward shutdown. Think about this carefully. An avoidant can intellectually know they hurt you, yet feel completely incapable of addressing it. The moment they consider reaching out, apologizing, or explaining themselves, their body reacts as if they're being threatened. Heart rate rises, chest tightens, thoughts scatter. Not because you're unsafe, but because accountability is. Accountability would force them to face an internal contradiction. I see myself as a good person, yet I acted in a way that caused harm. The contradiction produces shame, and shame demands escape. So they disappear. Not to punish you, not to assert power, but to avoid the internal collapse that would come from facing their own reflection. And here's the part most people never consider. Silence is not neutral. Silence is an active strategy. It's the avoidance way of keeping their self-image intact without having to repair the damage. If they don't speak about, if they don't name it, if they don't engage with you, then they can suspend the emotional reckoning. The relationship becomes unresolved, and unresolved feels safer than exposed. This is why you often sense something unfinished in them. You feel it in the way they linger energetically, in the way they check your social media, in the way they resurface indirectly or hover without commitment. That hovering is shame's shadow. They want relief, but they don't want responsibility. They want emotional regulation, but they don't want vulnerability. Your presence, however, makes this worse for them. Because when you were emotionally available, honest, and willing to engage, you represented a level of emotional integrity they couldn't meet. And when they failed to meet it by pulling away, invalidating you, or disappearing, they didn't just lose the relationship, they lost congruence with who they believed themselves to be. That's why silence intensifies after the rupture. Every message they don't send is a way of postponing that realization. Every day they don't reach out is another day they don't have to say, I mishandled something valuable. And yet, paradoxically, that very silence keeps the shame alive. Because avoidance doesn't erase awareness, it just buries it. This is also why chasing them backfires. When you pursue, explain, or try to get closure, you unknowingly give them an escape hatch. Your effort distracts them from their own internal reckoning. But when you stop, when you remove yourself emotionally and energetically, you leave them alone with the truth. And that truth is loud in silence. At some point, if growth occurs at all, it begins right there. Not in the conversation, not in the reunion, but in the quiet moment where they finally realize that silence didn't protect them. It only delayed the cost. And the reflection I'll leave you with is this. If someone goes silent after hurting you, don't rush to fill that silence. Let it do its work. Because sometimes the most powerful mirror you can hold up is your absence. And sometimes that's the only language shame understands. One of the biggest misconceptions about avoidant individuals is the belief that they're oblivious to the damage they cause. People often say they don't even realize what they did, or they're incapable of empathy. That's not accurate. In most cases, avoidants know exactly when they've crossed a line. They feel it in the moment your energy shifts, in the hesitation in your voice, in the silence that follows something they said or failed to say. Awareness is not their problem. Confrontation is. Avoidants are often highly perceptive. They can read emotional atmospheres with precision, but they've trained themselves not to engage with what they detect. When they pull away after hurting you, it's not because they didn't notice, it's because noticing triggered an internal alarm. That alarm says, this is getting too real, this is getting too close, this is exposing something I don't know how to fix. And rather than move toward repair, they retreat into self-containment. Here's where it gets important. Knowing they hurt you creates cognitive and emotional dissonance. On one hand, they want to see themselves as decent, reasonable, even caring. On the other hand, there's undeniable evidence that their behavior caused pain. That tension doesn't disappear, it circulates internally. It shows up as restlessness, irritability, rumination, or a vague sense of discomfort they can't quite name. And instead of translating that discomfort into an apology, they translate it into avoidance. Why? Because an apology would require emotional exposure. It would require saying, I see your pain, and I acknowledge my role in it. For someone with an avoidance structure, that sentence feels like standing emotionally naked in front of another person. It activates fear of rejection, fear of judgment, and perhaps most threatening of all, fear of dependency. If they admit fault, they risk needing you emotionally, and needing someone has historically felt unsafe to them. So they choose silence, deflection, or rationalization. They tell themselves the timing was wrong. They convince themselves you were too sensitive. They focus on your reactions instead of their actions. Not because these stories are true, but because they soften the blow of accountability. They reduce the intensity of shame just enough to remain functional. And yet deep down, the knowing doesn't go away. It sits there. It's why they remember certain moments with unusual clarity. The look on your face when they shut down, the message they left unread, the conversation they abruptly ended. These memories resurface at unexpected times, not as loud regret, but as quiet unease. That unease is unresolved responsibility. This is also why avoidants often struggle when they encounter someone new. They carry unfinished emotional business forward. Even if they never reach out to you, they measure future connections against the moment they failed to show up. That internal comparison can create self-doubt, emotional numbness, or an unconscious repetition of the same pattern, hurting, withdrawing, and then living with the residue of it. What matters for you is understanding this. Their lack of apology is not proof that your pain was insignificant. It's evidence that it was significant enough to overwhelm their coping mechanisms. If it hadn't mattered, they could have addressed it casually. The fact that they couldn't means it struck something deep. And this is where your power lies. You don't need their admission to validate your experience. You don't need their words to confirm what you already felt. When you stop waiting for them to articulate remorse, you reclaim your emotional authority. You move from seeking recognition to practicing self-respect. So let this settle in. Just because someone never says, I'm sorry, doesn't mean they don't know they should have. Sometimes the loudest admission of fault is the one they're too afraid to voice, and your next step is not to wait for it, but to live in a way that no longer requires it. When shame becomes too heavy to carry consciously, the mind looks for a way out. And for avoidant individuals, that escape rarely comes through accountability. It comes through reinterpretation. They don't just distance physically or emotionally, they distance psychologically. They begin to rewrite the story, not to deceive you, but to protect themselves from an internal collapse. This is where justification enters. Instead of asking, how did I contribute to this? The avoidant asks, how can I explain this in a way that hurts less? And the easiest way to do that is to shift the focus away from their behavior and onto your traits. Suddenly, your emotional needs become demands. Your boundaries become pressure. Your desire for clarity becomes control. This reframing isn't conscious manipulation. It's emotional self-preservation. Philosophically speaking, human beings are wired to avoid identity threat. When our actions contradict our self-image, we experience psychological pain. Avoidants, in particular, have a fragile relationship with self-examination. Their nervous system learned long ago that emotional scrutiny leads to overwhelm. So when shame arises, they don't sit with it. They narrate their way out of it. Distance then becomes essential, not because they've resolved anything, but because proximity keeps triggering the unresolved tension. Being near you, physically, emotionally, or even mentally, keeps activating the parts of them that feel inadequate. So they pull back, they reduce contact, they go quiet. And in that space, the rewritten narrative becomes more convincing because there's no immediate relational feedback to challenge it. This is why you may sense a sudden shift in how they describe the relationship, especially to others. What once felt meaningful is now minimized. What once felt mutual is now framed as one-sided. This isn't cruelty, it's cognitive triage. They're trying to stabilize their internal world by simplifying the story, by making you the problem so they don't have to be. But here's the cost. When someone rewrites reality to escape shame, they don't heal. They stagnate. Avoidance doesn't resolve internal conflict, it freezes it. The emotional lesson remains unlearned, waiting for the next relationship to activate it again. And often, that next person ends up playing the same role you did, unknowingly triggering the same defenses. For you, this process can be deeply disorienting. You remember the intimacy, the vulnerability, the moments of connection, and suddenly you're told it wasn't real or it wasn't that deep. This can make you question your perception, your emotional intelligence, even your worth. But understand this clearly, when someone revises history to feel okay about leaving, that revision says more about their internal struggle than about your value. There's a deeper psychological truth here. Distance doesn't equal closure. It equals suppression. And suppressed shame doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits for quiet moments, for late nights, for emotional lulls. It shows up as a sense of emptiness, a pattern of dissatisfaction, or a vague feeling that something was lost but never fully understood. This is also why avoidance can appear confident or detached on the surface while carrying unresolved regret underneath. Their justifications keep them functional but not fulfilled. They've avoided pain, but they've also avoided growth. Your role in this is not to correct their story. It's not to defend yourself or demand recognition. The moment you try to argue against their narrative, you step back into the dynamic where their emotional comfort takes priority over your truth. Growth happens when you stop participating in someone else's self-protection at the expense of your clarity. So here's what matters. You don't need to be understood by someone who isn't willing to understand themselves. You don't need validation from someone who had to distort reality to survive it. When you step back and hold your ground, you reclaim the narrative, not by force, but by integrity. And the reflection I'll leave you with is this. When someone has to rewrite the past to live with themselves, let them. Your responsibility is not to make the story comfortable for them. It's to live a life so grounded in truth that no revision can diminish it. One of the most underestimated forces in human psychology is the absence of noise. When you stop explaining, stop reaching out, stop trying to be understood, something profound happens in the avoidance internal world. The distraction disappears. And without distraction, the mind turns inward. That's when regret, quiet, unannounced, and persistent, begins to take shape while you were present. Your effort buffered them from themselves, your questions, your emotional bids. Even your frustration gave them something external to respond to. They could focus on managing you instead of examining themselves. But when you go silent, that shield collapses. There's no one to deflect onto. No conversation to reinterpret in their favor. No emotional stimulus to regulate through distance. There is just stillness, and stillness is where avoided truths resurface. This is why your silence feels different from theirs. Their silence was defensive. Yours is decisive. It's not about control or punishment. It's about withdrawal of emotional labor. And the moment that labor is gone, the avoidant loses the relational structure that kept their shame dormant. Regret doesn't come crashing in dramatically. It seeps in slowly through reflection. They didn't plan to have regret for an avoidant. Rarely sounds like, I made a mistake. It sounds more like something feels off. It shows up as restlessness, as replaying moments they thought were resolved, as an unexpected emotional reaction when something reminds them of you. These are not coincidences. They're the mind's attempt to integrate an experience that was never emotionally processed. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Your silence removes their ability to self-soothe through narrative. When you're no longer available to contradict or confirm their version of events, their story starts to feel incomplete. questions arise. Was I fair? Did I overreact? Why do I still think about this? Those questions don't mean they're ready to reconnect, but they do mean the avoidance strategy is failing. Psychologically, regret emerges when behavior violates one's internal values. Avoidants often suppress this by staying busy, detached, or emotionally numb. But silence disrupts that suppression. It creates a vacuum. And in that vacuum, unresolved emotion surfaces, not because they want it to, but because the mind seeks coherence. This is also why silence can feel empowering to you. It's not because you're waiting for a reaction. It's because you're no longer carrying the weight of being the emotional translator. You're allowing the consequences of their choices to unfold naturally. And that shift from trying to be understood to standing in your own understanding is transformative. Notice this carefully. When you go silent, you're not asking them to change. You're changing your position. You're no longer negotiating your worth or your reality. You're letting your absence speak where words failed. And that absence often becomes the loudest message they've received from you. But this is important. Silence is not a tactic if it's driven by hope. If you're silent to provoke regret, you remain emotionally tethered. True silence is rooted in self-respect, not strategy. It's the decision to stop over-functioning in a dynamic that required you to do all the emotional work. And if regret leads them to awareness, that's their journey. If it doesn't, your silence still serves you. It creates space for healing, clarity, and forward movement. You stop waiting for an apology that may never come, and you start building a life that doesn't require one. So the reflection I'll leave you with is this. When you choose silence from a place of strength, you're not disappearing. You're reclaiming your energy. And sometimes the most profound closure comes not from what is said, but from what you no longer need to say at all. There is a moment in many avoidant journeys that never gets talked about, because it doesn't happen in relationship. It happens in solitude. Change, if it ever comes for an avoidant, does not arrive through confrontation, ultimatums, or emotional pleas. It arrives quietly after the noise is gone, when there is no one left to blame, manage, or escape from. And the emotion that initiates that process is not love or longing, it's shame. Shame is often misunderstood as something purely destructive. But psychologically, shame is also a signal. It points to a violation of one's own values, a fracture between who someone believes they are and how they actually behaved. For avoidance, that fracture is usually buried under layers of detachment and rationalization. But when the relationship ends and the other person truly leaves, not emotionally, not energetically, but fully, the protective layers thin. There's no external regulation left. And that's when shame has the potential to transform. This is where awakening begins, if it begins at all. Not with missing you, but with realizing what they lost in themselves. The loss of emotional safety, the loss of integrity, the loss of the opportunity to grow through connection rather than escape it. This realization doesn't feel dramatic. It feels sobering. It feels like a quiet reckoning that says, I keep ending up here. What's important to understand is that this awakening is not guaranteed. Shame can harden just as easily as it can soften. Some avoidants double down on detachment. They distract themselves, repeat patterns, or convince themselves that emotional depth is overrated. But for others, especially those with enough self-awareness or life experience, shame beco. Mez the turning point. It forces a question they can no longer outrun. What am I protecting and what is it costing me? If growth happens, it doesn't look like a sudden apology or dramatic return. It looks like introspection. It looks like recognizing patterns across relationships. It looks like discomfort that no longer gets numbed but examined. And often long after you've moved on, they realize that you weren't the problem. You were the invitation to evolve. This is why your departure matters more than your presence ever could. When you stayed, they could remain unconscious. When you left with dignity, you became the emotional event that broke the loop. Not because you tried to teach them a lesson, but because you stopped absorbing the consequences of their avoidance. And here's the most empowering truth for you. Whether they awaken or not is irrelevant to your next chapter. Their shame is not your responsibility to heal. Their growth is not your project. You were not placed in their life to be the catalyst and then remain stuck waiting for the result. Your role was to show up authentically, to love honestly, to set boundaries when needed, and when that was no longer reciprocated, to leave without abandoning yourself. That act alone is powerful. It sends a message not just to them, but to your own nervous system. I will not betray myself to maintain connection. And often, that's the lesson they never forget. They may forget the details. They may rewrite parts of the story. But they don't forget the feeling of losing someone who walked away without chaos, without cruelty, without collapse. That kind of loss lingers. It becomes a reference point, a silent benchmark for what they once had and didn't know how to hold. So here's the reflection I want you to sit with. You don't need to wait for someone's awakening to validate your worth. Live in a way that honors your growth now, because whether they evolve or not, the moment you chose yourself became the moment everything changed. What many people never realize is that the deepest discomfort an avoidant experiences isn't caused by conflict. It's caused by contrast. And you were that contrast. Your emotional availability, your willingness to communicate, your ability to stay present in discomfort didn't just challenge them relationally, it exposed them internally.